Hello, my name is Mike Baker, and I'm the manager of museums and archives for the County of Elgin. This talk was to have been given at the Southern Area Tweedsmuir workshop hosted by the Elgin District Women's Institute at the Keystone Complex in Shedden on August 11, 2020. I was pleased and honored to have been asked to address the workshop because, of course, the museum owes its existence to the Elgin County Women's Institute. As well, the Tweedsmuir books remain one of the most valuable resources we have in the county archives. They are referred to on a regular basis, and I've used photos from them many times in museum exhibits. Today, I will present an update on the long and fruitful relationship Elgin County Museum has had with Jumbo the elephant. In the past several years, many people have rediscovered Jumbo's story, inspiring a raft of books, plays, exhibits, statues, and even an episode on two of television's most popular programs. Among the many Jumbo projects of the past few years was the appearance in 2014 of Jumbo, the unauthorized biography of a Victorian sensation, written by Englishman John Sutherland, an academic and author. It is a very personal retelling of the Jumbo story, which also promotes a conspiracy theory around Jumbo's death, suggesting that it was widely known that he was dying and that his trainer actually intentionally led him onto the tracks the night he died in 1885. Also in that year, a rare artifact hit the market, a slice of one of Jumbo's tusks, which is now in the possession of our local Jumbo booster, Steve Peters. 2014 also marked the 125th anniversary of the arrival of Jumbo's stuffed hide at Tufts University near Boston, where P.T. Barnum had funded a museum of natural history. The statue pictured in the opening slide was unveiled early the following year in honor of that anniversary. And in 2015, the museum was a stop on the Free Press's annual Shunpiker Tour, for which we produced a special exhibit on Jumbo on the main floor of the county building. Over 400 people visited the site in the course of the day. In 2016, Mark O'Neill, the CEO of the Canadian Museum of History, made a personal visit to the museum, bringing with him a Jumbo cigar box made in St. Thomas from the National Museum's collection and to be placed on loan with us. He had read a Times Journal column by Eric Bennell on how he thought the box was the holy grail for Jumbo collectors here. In 2017, we were included in an episode of not one, but two of the best known popular science shows on television. More on that in a minute. And just last year, a play on Jumbo was commissioned by the Blythe Festival. Our museum hosted a panel discussion on the play and provided a pop-up museum at the theater in Blythe. Written by Sean Dixon, it recreates a circus on stage with a full-size Jumbo, portrayed as a sort of silent friend to all the characters who tell their stories to him. For the museum, possibly the most interesting and certainly the most surprising of these recent Jumbo projects was the request in the spring of 2017 by our production company to look at our tiny Jumbo collection to see if it could be incorporated into the Philomela script they had sold to both the CBC and the BBC. The result was that in May of that year, two separate production companies arrived at the museum 10 days apart, one with David Suzuki and one with David Attenborough in attendance. Sir David had apparently always wanted to do a show on Jumbo, and when his producer discovered that the American Museum of Natural History would let the bones out of storage for examination, he started to assemble the team of scientists who would be able to examine them and answer questions about what Jumbo's life was like and compare it to that of elephants of today. Seen at lower right are Professor John Hutchison on the left, Dr. Holly Miller, and Dr. Richard Thomas, all scientists from the United Kingdom. They did the real detective work, examining the bones and the teeth and figuring out what his diet was. Their conclusion was that Jumbo really had a bad toothache for many, many years, or more like a teethache. Earlier sets of teeth that should have been ground down by eating the right food were staying put, while new teeth were coming in right behind them. Some of these teeth can be seen in the skull picture in the upper right. It was the result of too many sticky buns from the kids at the zoo. And so the stories of Scott, which you'll hear about soon, dousing him with alcohol had a real purpose: to numb Jumbo's pain. Another fairly recent book, Jumbo, the Greatest Elephant in the World, written by Paul Chambers, a former paleontologist from Great Britain. It appeared in 2008. It provides a very detailed tracing of Jumbo's life and the world he lived in during the years of his greatest fame, from 1881 to his death in 1885. What follows is a brief outline of Jumbo's life drawn from this book. The first recorded sighting of Jumbo is recounted in a book by British explorer Samuel White Baker, who met him in Africa shortly after his capture in 1862 in the region known today as Eritrea. Only about a year old, he was then in the hands of his captors, a group of Hamran tribesmen led by Tahir Sharif. White recalls seeing 2 elephant calves, one of which he describes as a scrawny runt, who he thought wouldn't be able to make the long journey to Europe. And yet, it was this runt who would become the first African elephant to be brought to Europe in many years, and who by the time of his death had become the first animal to achieve transatlantic stardom. When Jumbo was captured in 1862, there were only about 20 elephants in European zoos, and all of them were Indian, a much smaller animal than the African elephant. In 1851, a stuffed female African elephant was shown at the Great Exhibition of that year. It drew thousands. By the 1860s, interest in African elephants was quite high enough to make the dangerous and expensive trip to Africa to capture one worthwhile. The 2 largest and oldest zoos of the day were in London and Paris, both of which are still going. The London Zoo, in fact, until recently, received about 1 million visitors a year. More formally known as the Zoological Society Gardens in Regent's Park, it was established in 1828. In the lower right is the Giraffe House, built in 1836 and still in use. In Paris, the zoo is in a very old public park called the Jardin des Plantes, itself established in 1626 as a medicinal herbarium for Louis XIII. The animals arrived after the Revolution in the 1790s, when the royal menagerie was moved there from Versailles. Both zoos had elephants, but none were African. In London, Jack, an Asian elephant who had been a crowd favorite, had died in 1847. He'd been the largest in Europe and was known as a great tusker. That is, he sported a pair of very large tusks. His death was followed by the demise of the female elephant in 1855. So desperate was the London Zoo for an African elephant that in 1858, they offered the great explorer David Livingstone 150 pounds, which might be as much as 10,000 pounds today, to find one and ship it home via Mozambique. He declined, so they settled in to wait for another opportunity. Meanwhile, back in Africa, Jumbo the runt was on his way with a large number of other animals to Kassala, where they were taken possession of by Johann Schmidt, a Bavarian working for Lorenzo Casanova, a man who had gambled his entire fortune on getting a large number of African animals to Europe to sell to zoos and menageries. From Kassala, the animals had to cross 300 miles of desert to the port of Sudan, surviving on goat milk and meat. And even though they traveled at night to avoid the heat, a number of the specimens were lost. At the Red Sea, Jumbo and the others were loaded onto a ship and sent to the port of Suez. Then by train to Alexandria, where they were put into another ship and taken to Trieste, northern Italy. As an indication of the interest the public had for exotic animals, nearly the entire population of Trieste turned out to watch the unloading. The whole lot was purchased by a traveling menagerie, and for a few months, Jumbo, still a runt, was moved around to different towns in Germany until the animals were sold off. And this is how he ended up at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Even before he arrived, the Jardin had become overcrowded. The gardens already had 2 elephants, and 2 more arrived after Jumbo, putting 5 elephants in the rotunda, which also held camels, giraffes, and at least 1 hippo. 2 of the elephants are pictured here, probably the star attractions, aptly named Castor and Pollux. Some problems with the administration of the site led to an investigation which recommended that some of the elephants be traded. The London Zoo, hearing of the problems in Paris, made inquiries about the elephants and obtained Jumbo. His small size likely led to the decision to let him go, but small as he was, the French demanded a lot in return. The final trade included 2 young dingoes, a black-backed jackal, a pair of wedge-tailed eagles, a possum, a kangaroo, and an Indian rhino, which London was happy to get rid of because it was bad-tempered. With the African elephant on the way, the superintendent of the London Zoo, Abraham Bartlett, selected a young assistant keeper named Matthew Scott to look after him. Scott had had a lot of success in breeding animals at the zoo, especially the antelope, which he had brought down himself in 1851 from the Earl of Derby's estate, where he had previously worked. It was now 1865, and in June, Scott went to Paris to collect the elephant. And here he is in that year. It was likely in England where Jumbo received his name. Street slang at the time referred to a raggedly dressed person with a patched coat as my Jumbo, a reference to a similarly dressed holy man in Africa, known as the Mumbo Jumbo, who resolved domestic disputes. The term had appeared in a book by African explorer Mungo Park in 1795, giving the phrase a good 70 years to become a common expression. Because he had been ill, Jumbo's hide may have resembled that of the African holy man, and so he became my Jumbo, a call he may have received from workers in the street, such as hawkers, hack drivers, watermen, as he walked across London with Scott from the Waterloo station. One can see his still diminutive stature here. However, he steadily improved in health as he was walked about the zoo, where he was an immediate hit. Soon a saddle was provided so that visitors could ride on him, and eventually this became a howdah, a large box-like device with step seats to allow riders view. The ride lasts 10 to 15 minutes and cost a penny. Bizarrely, Bartlett allowed Scott to keep the proceeds, which some years ran to £800, about 10 times his regular salary. Everyone rode on Jumbo. This poster, produced in later years by Barnum, shows the howdah in use and claims in the copy below that 1.25 million British children rode on his back in the 17 years he was at the zoo, including Queen Victoria's children and her grandchildren. Scott's close bond with Jumbo was greatly strengthened at the end of 1867, when Jumbo grew quite ill. His recovery at Scott's hands was dramatic and rumored at the time to have been hastened along with, quote, bucketfuls of scotch. This comes from the reminiscence of a zoo employee and is quoted in Chambers' book. Jumbo could never shake his alleged weakness for booze. In fact, it is referred to in this popular song, written in 1882, just before his trip to America. One verse is, "Oh, have you seen the elephant?" is all the people's cry. "The great and mighty elephant who stands so broad and high. He daily eats a ton of hay and drinks upon the sly a tub of circus lemonade and several pints of rye." As the years passed, there developed a new cause for concern. For however docile he was in walks with children during the day, at night he began to attack his home, the elephant house, pictured here. And he began to grind down what should have been very large tusks into mere stumps. By 1875, he was 9 feet tall and weighed 3 tons. Only Scott could control him, and he used this to his advantage, often being rude, obstructive, and secretive to his fellow keepers and his superiors. So it is not surprising that Bartlett was looking for a way to reduce the power Scott had at the zoo, and he began to insist that Scott take on an assistant. However, one would be hard to find, given the potential danger the animal posed and the lack of interest Scott had in training anyone. By 1881, Jumbo's attacks on the elephant house were doing considerable damage. Now 11 feet tall and weighing 5 tons, he had the potential to destroy the place. And yet he was still calm enough during the day to allow children to ride safely. Chambers suggests the reason for the attacks came from the fact that he was now 20 years old and at the height of his sexual development, and susceptible to must, a word for the periods of near madness lasting 10 days or more. So worried was Bartlett that by the end of 1881, he had received permission to destroy the animal with a high-powered rifle if he was forced to, in the event of an illness or accident befalling Scott. But it was just at this moment, late in 1881, that Bartlett received a telegram, which read, "What is the lowest price you can take for the large male African elephant?" Signed, Barnum, Bailey, and Hutchison. Since 1871, P.T. Barnum had been traveling a museum, a menagerie, a caravan, and a hippodrome around the U.S. by rail, calling it the greatest show on earth. In 1881, he merged it with shows belonging to James Bailey and James Hutchison. They were looking for the next big thing, and Jumbo seemed to foot the bill. But with the 1882 season approaching, they would have to move fast. Bartlett wasted no time in replying. He would take 2,000 pounds, then about 10,000 US. Today, this would perhaps be as much as 240,000 pounds, or about 412,000 Canadian dollars. Bartlett also insisted that the Americans arrange and pay for the shipping. Matthew Scott, who likely heard about the sale through the Times newspaper, was to accompany Jumbo, and Bartlett was probably delighted with this. Now 5 tons and 11 feet high, the question was how to move him. The plan was to build a box, a giant crate on wheels, to take him to the dock. And as you can see, Jumbo didn't think very much of this. This is from a Barnum poster, which is a fairly accurate portrayal of his trip to America. At one point, the plan changed to one where they would walk Jumbo to the dock. But on the day they tried walking him, he reached the road and stopped dead, sank to his knees, and howled. This was too good for the papers to pass up, and there followed extensive coverage of Jumbo's refusal to go. Letters to editors flooded in, demanding that Jumbo stay. When his London agents asked Barnum what to do, Barnum replied, "Let him lie there as long as he wants to." After all, you couldn't buy publicity like this. Popular opinion against the sale mounted. Several Zoological Society members even launched a court battle against the zoo's trustees, arguing that the animal was dangerous and shouldn't be sold on moral grounds. Also, the society charter didn't allow the sale of significant specimens. While all this was going on, Jumbo stayed on the job in the zoo, giving rides to a steadily growing number of visitors. Zoo attendance skyrocketed. On February 27, 8,500 people visited, whereas a year earlier on that day, only 647 had attended. The first attempt with a new crate was witnessed by 6,000 people. It was unsuccessful, and after the attempt, the weekend visitors totaled 16,000. Clever advertisers began to connect their product with Jumbo and his battle with the crate. A thread company in Williamite, Connecticut, suggested its thread was so strong it could pull Jumbo over to America. The Pine State Java Coffee Company used a very accurate depiction of the crate in their trade cards. And many other companies would appropriate Jumbo's name and likeness to promote their products once he arrived in the US. The lawsuit launched by some of the society's members did make Barnum uneasy. He had ordered quite a lot of printing at a cost of about $30,000 for a show that was to open in April of that year, and Jumbo was still at the zoo in England. "Employ best counsel," he cabled. "Spare no expense." Finally, the judge found for the society, saying only fraud would be grounds to stop the sale. Daily visits to the zoo now totaled 20,000, 10 times the normal traffic. Bartlett suspected Scott was behind the elephant's reluctance to enter his box, so he ordered him to take a vacation. Scott confessed and said he would cooperate. Here, you can see the box has been placed right at the door of the elephant house, forcing Jumbo to step into it. That is Scott and Barnum's agent, Bill Newman, standing beside Jumbo in the lower right. Once Jumbo was safely inside, it was pulled through the streets to the dock and lowered into the hold. The ship, the Assyrian Monarch, then set sail on March 25th with Jumbo, Scott, and 409 impoverished immigrants on board. During the last 18 days of Jumbo's stay in the zoo, 150,000 people had visited. The long wait also built up excitement for Jumbo's arrival in New York City, which finally happened on Easter Sunday, April 9th, 1882. Here, still in his crate, Jumbo is drawn up Broadway to the Madison Square Gardens, where the circus will open, and is witnessed by a crowd of over 10,000. The circus then took to the road, visiting 80 towns in the next 5 months. It filled 100 carriages and freight cars and was pulled by 4 locomotives. Jumbo had his own car, known as the Jumbo Palace, which had been built especially for him. Jumbo and the circus may have come to St. Thomas in 1882. They were certainly here in 1883, because the museum has the poster to prove it. This was found during the renovation of a house in Forest Ave in 1983. Some boards that were removed from the building renovation had once been part of a fence or a hoarding, and that's when the poster had been plastered onto them. Then they had been flipped over and reused in the building, and thus protected the paper poster until the renovation a century later. A complete poster can be seen at right. By the fall of 1885, Jumbo was ill again with an unknown ailment. Barnum, now concerned that the end could be near, put the best taxidermist in the US, a man named Henry Ward, on call. And that call came September 16th, 1885. The collision occurred after the end of the second show. Jumbo and the smallest elephant, Tom Thumb, were being led along the tracks on the Grand Trunk main line, which is CN today. A signalman failed to stop an oncoming freight. Jumbo ran down the tracks, but the engine caught up to him, threw him into the adjacent circus train, and then itself derailed. He only survived for a few minutes. In Barnum's version, seen on the right, Jumbo charges the train in an effort to save Tom Thumb. Tom Thumb did survive with only a broken leg. Over 100 men were needed to pull Jumbo off the tracks. Ward arrives from Rochester the next day and proceeds with the help of local butchers to remove the hide and clean the bones. Spectators were charged 5 cents by the landowner to watch. Many things were discovered in Jumbo's stomach, mostly coins, possibly grabbed by Jumbo's trunk from the outstretched hands of youngsters while still at the zoo. This collection, composed of a charm in the shape of a 6-shooter, a pig-shaped match safe whose head is on a hinge, a collar stud, and a tooth, among other things, was obtained by a boy named Bert Sumner. He's pictured here in the famous shot of the dead Jumbo. He's in the broad-brimmed straw hat right behind Jumbo with a hand in his pocket. The hide was stuffed, the skeleton reassembled, and both were then put on tour with the circus for 3 years. You can see them displayed in a tent just going up in the upper left. The unveiling of the skeleton in February of 1886 inspired this political cartoon, the lower left, entitled Patching Up the Republican Jumbo for 1888 by Joseph Kepler. It was published in Puck, the premier journal of graphic humor and political satire in the US. Here, Kepler uses the recently reassembled skeleton of Jumbo to carry the Republican platform for the coming '88 election. A note on the banner at left refers to an accident, though here it's not a collision with a train, it's the loss of the White House in 1884. The bones would eventually go to New York, to the American Museum of Natural History. Here, they were on permanent exhibit until 1969. The display is seen at upper right. They reappeared for a few months in 1993 to mark the 200th anniversary of the circus in America. The skeleton was returned to storage that fall. The picture of the skull and teeth in the lower right was taken during the time they were unpacked for the filming of the television shows. In April of 1889, the stuffed hide was sent to Tufts University near Boston. Barnum had paid for the building of a natural science museum on the campus, that's it to the left, which he filled with specimens he found or retired from the circus. This was taken on the day the hide arrived, and it has just been discovered that Jumbo was too big to fit in the door. The doors and much of the surrounding stonework had to be removed to get him in. Jumbo remained here until fire destroyed the building in 1975. The only piece that survives is his tail, which was in the archives by then. It had finally fallen off after being pulled on so many times by students, hoping for good luck before an exam. The morning after the fire, a member of the athletics department filled a peanut butter jar with ashes from the area where Jumbo had stood. It too is regarded as a good luck charm by the college's teams. This is Tufts' authority on Jumbo, Professor Andrew McClelland, and below is the tale in its archival box. Jumbo's role on the campus has continued to grow over the years, becoming the college's unofficial mascot in the 1930s. Today, all teams are named the Jumbos, and they wear a crest depicting the head of a fierce-looking Jumbo with a couple of very pointy tusks. The 125th anniversary of the arrival of the stuffed hide in 1889 was marked in 2014 with a major exhibition and a book, and the unveiling the following year of a full-size bronze statue designed by a well-known American sculptor, Stephen White. It is based on a photo from his time at the zoo, and in it, Jumbo was about to catch a bun in his mouth, thrown by his keeper, Matthew Scott. As with Tufts, the association with St. Thomas has been gradually built up. But for years, the town tried to live down its association with Jumbo. In this booster book, printed in 1914, Jumbo gets a nice 2-page entry. However, it begins by noting that the newspaper in town, quote, still receives inquiries every little while from some part of the civilized world asking for the date and story of the killing of Jumbo. It is the price that St. Thomas and its citizens have paid and continue to pay for the most widespread notoriety that ever came to a small community from so trivial a happening. Only slowly did St. Thomas realize that maybe it wasn't so trivial, and that continued interest in Jumbo's unfortunate death could be turned to the town's advantage. The 50th anniversary of the accident, in 1935, offered another opportunity to connect with the Jumbo legacy. This time, he gets a tiny role in the Old Home Week that had been organized for the July 1st weekend. A tiny Jumbo appears on the cover, and inside, he receives another 2 pages, recounting the tragedy. But the title under the picture now says Jumbo's Last Night Under the Big Top, not the killing of Jumbo, as was used in 1914. They also made about 100 metal commemorative street signs in the shape of Jumbo, seen here at lower right. But most of them disappeared overnight, as they made great souvenirs and are actually still highly collectible. A 35-page illustrated book was also published, The Story of Jumbo, written by a local promoter named Edwards. In it, Edwards says that a cairn was to be installed at the spot where the collision occurred, but this doesn't seem to have happened. And in fact, it wasn't until 1977 that the site would be marked. In that year, the Provincial Historic Sites plaque shown here went up, and in the photo above can be seen 2 eyewitnesses to the 1885 event. By 1985, the city had realized that there was a world of interest in Jumbo, and they were crazy not to be taking advantage of it. The 100th anniversary was astutely capitalized on by the mayor of the day, Doug Terry, who had been inspired by oversized roadside figures elsewhere in Ontario, such as the Sudbury Nickel, the Wawa Goose, the Muskie at Kenora, and the Moose at Dryden. Fate had handed St. Thomas something that was already giant, but they made it bigger and gave it tusks. The monument was built by New Brunswick artist Winston Bronham, who would go on to create the world's largest lobster at Shediac and a giant potato in Maugerville, New Brunswick. The anniversary of Jumbo's death was a 5-day extravaganza, highlighted by the unveiling of the 35-ton concrete statue, and featured many souvenirs, including Indiana Jones-style hats, souvenir coins, and a booklet. There is even a miniature circus convention. Well, that was 35 years ago. What about today? If we look closely at the recently adopted brand for St. Thomas the Railway City, we can still see Jumbo. The railway reference is in the center, where the O has been made into a stylized locomotive with the smoke coming out of a non-existent stack. The swirling smoke assumes the shape of an elephant's head, and in the middle is a tiny little eye. A subtle tribute to the spirit of Jumbo, say the designers. So you can see Jumbo has not been forgotten, even to this day. It remains to be seen what form future interest in Jumbo's story will take, but it's clear he's been adopted here in St. Thomas, where his giant monument continues to attract attention from around the world. Thank you.